Good evening. I'm Chris Saines, Director of the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art. Welcome. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the unceded land on which this gallery stands on the banks of the Maiwar, a gathering and low crossing point, an enduring place of trade and exchange. I recognise the Turrbal, Yuggera and Yugara peoples as the first peoples to gather and meet here, the first makers and storytellers to dream here, and recognise their elders past, present and emerging. In the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge the vital contribution that First Nations Australians make to the custodianship of country and the strength of culture within our shared creative community. I acknowledge them as I acknowledge all First Nations people who are present with us tonight and extend this welcome to you all. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Anna Svensdotter, Executive Director of the Australian Institute of Architects, Queensland chapter, to extend her welcoming remarks. Anna.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Anna Svensdotter. I am the Queensland Executive Director for the Australian Institute of Architects. It's an honour to welcome you all to Architecture, Consciousness, Ecology and Willfulness, which has been brought together by Francis Jones Carpenter's studio. We come together today to explore the deeper dimensions of architecture, the tension between conscious decisions we make, the ecological responsibilities we embrace, and the willfulness that can sometimes drive our creations. The topic could not be more timely as our industry continues to evolve, adapting to the challenges of climate change, sustainability, and the need to design with thoughtfulness and care. I'm thrilled to see such an engaged audience here tonight. Thinkers, professionals, collaborators. This is a space where we can share ideas, challenge each other, and hopefully leave inspired to influence the built environment for the better. Before we dive into today's presentations, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Cathy Inglis from Think Brick. Cathy is an influential voice in the architectural materials industry, and we are grateful for the support that she and Think Brick offers our industry for this discussion. Thank you once again, and enjoy your evening.
Good evening, all. It's great to be here. When I read the chapter of the book, the first line was Louis Kahn's statement, "What do you want to be, brick?" What does a brick want to be? An arch and anything else. It can be anything you want it to be. So at Think Brick, we actually help architects and designers make sure you can realise the capacity and ability of brick to do anything you want to in a design. We offer amazing engineering and resources to be able to work out how to do that. And looking at the ecology, we've recently completed a sustainability strategy and a decarbonisation roadmap to 2050 for the industry. It's a great document and leads us on a path to how we're going to decarbonise the brick industry towards 2050. So what do you want to be, brick? I look forward to the discussion this evening. Welcome all and thank you.
I have to repeat reading that section from Richard's book. And I realise why Think Brick is sponsoring this event when Richard Brooks said Louis Kahn said he spoke to a brick. Unusual maybe, but truly amazing when the brick returned the conversation with architectural axioms. Delightfully revelational for me, as often told to have brick for brains, I now know the reasons why I'm able to speak to you tonight. Truth and Lies in Architecture I placed on top of my Phantom and Asterix comics beside the bed for a nighttime read before the demons visited my dreams. Not too far into the book, I had used up all the vegetables I know to substitute for words whose meanings I don't. Decided my only chance of comprehension was to read in the morning. That's when bricks retrieve data best. The impressive knowledge in the book reflects Richard's high achievements from student days on. Concluded he did an airline pilot's course where 99% is required to pass before doing architecture. In my student days, I listened to that renowned student philosopher Anonymous, who said 50% is a pass and 51% is wasted effort. It resulted in an extended student career. I will quote a few lines from the book that stood out for me. The parasitic meta-ideology of commodification on all-consuming valuelessness through which we are reduced from citizens to mere consumers. This sentence vividly reminded me of years ago when the Brisbane City Council concluded to not refer to people as citizens, but as customers. A screaming message, just pay your rates and contribute nothing. When coming across the word synthetic in lieu of sophisticated, I was ecstatic. This quote represents the intent somewhat. Mirror the conditions and values of contemporary life, disconnected from the concreteness of existence, where we are more interested in the price of consumables than the questions of being. On reading Hardly Anybody Makes Anything Anymore, I thought in my humility, I have written an article of equal elegant, articulate English that could form a missing chapter in the book. It's called The Dunnyisation of Residences. It proposes if you converted the multiple dunnies, you would have a workshop to make something. Some moments the sentence sent me from ecstatic to euphoric. The tragic, ubiquitous, mechanically serviced glass office boxes of the 20th century are not architecture. Any building that damages and undermines our symbiosis with the natural world is not architecture. Building development and construction perhaps, but not architecture. What I have been describing as bare-ass glass buildings, I have decided to remove glass as the adjective. After all, they are a well-designed functional construction of multiple shapes and sizes and dynamic emulations and beauty. I apologise to asses for the insult. I got into strife for reading Genesis recently. Richard also read it. His quote, but also our Judean-Christian tradition that preferences the soul of humanity above all other forms of animal and natural life, which are to be served up for human use. Taking the role of a Pharisee's priest, I will read the reference. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over everything that creepeth upon the earth. I am mesmerised by ancient Egypt. I once gave a talk to a group of left-wing socialists. The subject was, monumentality is a social justice essential. Richard explains with the most accurate clarity how the magnificent monumental buildings of the ancient Egyptians were conceived as achievable and built. Monumentality is concerned not with private interest, but with what is shared, the public interest, the willing sacrifice of the interests of the individual for the collective. Leaving Richard booked, I have pleasure for Richard Saines to take over as the MC for this occasion. Thank you.
Thank you, Russell, and thank you also to Anna, and Cathy. I am delighted to join with our host, FJC Studio, and its design director, Richard Francis Jones, in extending a very warm welcome again to you all. Welcome to the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art, comprising what I think are two of the best designed galleries of their generations in Australia. My role here is to be your MC and moderator of our forthcoming panel discussion. In other words, to keep you all on time and on point, particularly my panellists, and ensuring that we move through our ambitious agenda just in time to land outside for drinks at 8 p.m. While that might be our destination, I can promise you you're in for a fascinating, challenging, and very exciting journey to that end. It begins with a keystone presentation from Richard to anchor his provocation, Architecture, Consciousness, Ecology or Willfulness, which I feel certain will have already stopped you in your tracks, as it just did to Russell. This will be followed by short rejoinders from our three esteemed panellists, Anna O'Gorman, Erin Peters and Tahlia Steadman, who will then join with Richard and me on stage for a panel discussion. But before I continue, perhaps I should apologise to Cathy for my materially insensitive keystone reference a moment ago, which has invariably left Brick and his arch desires right out of the frame. Although in saying that, I'm confident he's thriving under Think Brick's creative stewardship. There we are, sponsorship acknowledgement, tick. Moving on, I am really delighted that we're able to host this event at Goma tonight, and I'm thrilled that it's drawn such strong interest. It's a great crowd. Its themes arise directly out of one of 15 essays, all of them meditations in the spirit of Marcus Aurelius on the architect and architecture, that appear in Richard's most recent book, Truth and Lies in Architecture, which was published by ORO Editions in 2022. The essay in question, The Consciousness of the Architect, takes the form of a dialogue with self and with like-minded others. And I quote, "As architects, we're used to thinking about consciousness within architecture, of finding a form that embodies social purpose and aspirations, of imbuing architecture with life. Even simple material units, architects imbue with life or mind," end quote. Richard Francis Jones is a leading contemporary Australian architect, a Fellow of the Australian Institute of Architects and Honorary Fellow of the American Institute of Architects. Richard trained at the University of Sydney and later at Columbia University in New York. In a distinguished career, he has designed award-winning buildings and been recognised in numerous architectural competitions. He is design director and the nominated architect of FJC Studio in Sydney, an acclaimed practice noted for its commitment to the public domain. I have known Richard for more than 20 years, 10 of them spent as a client representative on the heritage restoration and expansion of the 1887 Auckland Art Gallery Toyotamaki from 2002 to 2011, with 3 of those years squandered in an environment court defending its design. But despite that, the gallery became the country's most awarded building ever, ultimately being named World Building of the Year. I know Richard to be a quiet and reflective design thinker, an architect whose practice is informed by theory but determinedly not driven by it. Would you please welcome Richard to the stage?
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Russell, also. Well, during the COVID lockdowns, like many of us, I was very stressed, and perhaps it's a little bit weird, but I wrote a few essays more as a mental health exercise than anything else. And somehow it evolved into this book. And this book really is on the nature of contemporary architecture and the great challenges of being an architect. It was a kind of act of camaraderie, really, with anyone who steps into this profession. And the thoughts I'm going to share with you now expand on one of these essays titled The Consciousness of the Architect. Now, you might think that talking about bricks would be a strange way to start a conversation about consciousness. And you might be suspicious that I'm only doing this in this way to tribute our kind sponsor. But there may be more to bricks than we think, and perhaps at least we can start here. After all, we have been using bricks to mould places for dwelling for thousands of years. Here in this image, mud bricks from Konya, 7,400 BC. And we have used them in fired form since 3,500 BC. And for learned guidance on bricks and how to use them, we could perhaps turn to the words of the great American architect, Louis Kahn. And I quote directly, "If you think of brick, you say to brick, 'What do you want, brick?' Brick says to you, 'I like an arch.' And you say to brick, 'Look, arches are expensive, and I can use a concrete lintel over you. What do you think of that, brick?' And brick says, 'I like an arch.' And it is important, you see, that you honour the material that you use. And you can only do it if you honour the brick and glorify the brick, instead of short-changing it. On one level, these famous words from Kahn are deeply unhelpful, and maybe even do a disservice to our professional credibility. I mean, it's not very helpful on a construction site, in conversations with the builders and bricklayers, to bring up the wishes, likes and dislikes of bricks. Neither it is helpful in conversations with engineers, clients or cost planners to explain that bricks prefer arches to lintels. The very idea that architects actually talk to bricks would only seem to reinforce the perception that we are a deluded profession. And I would only have the courage to begin a talk with such a quote if I was in a room full of architects. But on another level, these words from Kahn are deeply profound and go beyond the limits of architecture because they lead us to question the nature of consciousness. Consciousness is what it is to be you, that internal experience, that awareness of options in life with the associated hopes and anxieties. It is the authorship of decisions and the consequences that follow. That sense that you are unique and have agency over your life. We seem to confidently take our consciousness for granted. It is simply what it is to be me or you. But consciousness has long been something of a blind spot in our science. Where is it? How does it work? And why is it so opaque to scientific investigation? So elusive and mysterious? Is it even real? Maybe it is just a deceit within the otherwise detectable and measurable processes of our minds. No, it must be real. It is what it is to be a person. Without it, we would be, well, empty. Consciousness seems to be hard to deny, but also easy to ignore. It is easy to intuit, but very hard to explain. In recent years, we have seen a renewed focus on how consciousness can be explained and how central it is to our understanding of our world and the nature of our existence. Perhaps there is also a sense of urgency in understanding consciousness beyond a mere human consciousness, as we try to come to terms with the ethical and environmental issues of our time, as we try to understand how we value forms of life or even define life, extending it not only to the breadth of the natural world and natural systems, but our own transformations of the world in the form of our inventions, automations, manufacturings, and particularly in the form of artificial intelligence. These questions, confrontations, and challenges are all pressing our limited definitions of consciousness. In the modern world, we have tended to divide its inhabitants into two groups, those possessing consciousness and those who do not, or more simply put, into persons and things. Persons are afforded significant protections and rights, while non-persons or things are assigned almost none and are viewed in purely instrumental terms, with their existence relegated to their use value by the first group. They are there to be used and used up. The boundary between these two groups is surprisingly subtle and relies on often relatively small differences. Certain human beings themselves have been pushed into the second group of things based on differences that are very fine, such as the colour of skin, or the shape of the eyes, or gender, or even non-physical attributes such as language or beliefs. Once fallen into the category of things, where almost no rights or protections are assigned, there is little impediment to the consequential exploitation, brutalization, and degradation that the perceived absence of consciousness seems to invite. While this fall for human beings into the group of non-conscious things is generally now viewed as inaccurate, abhorrent, and morally wrong, a difference of life species remains an easy and generally acceptable distinction. It seems to matter little that the subspecies also have many attributes in common with the category of persons, such as eyes, faces, bodies, the experience of pain, emotions, and the formation of family and social bonds. These subspecies of life are viewed as mere things and afforded little relative protections or rights. Their social and family bonds are entirely unrecognised, and they are unnecessarily and unsustainably exploited on an industrial scale as a preferred food choice for the first group. Beyond animal life species, as the matter of the world slides into forms of even less perceived consciousness, such as insects, rivers, trees, and bushland, there is no question or consideration of assigning life rights. These are without doubt mere things, devoid of consciousness, to be served up for our manipulation, exploitation, and use. What then of the instruments we have fashioned out of the lifeless matter of the world, the machines and systems we have invented and bent to our purpose and will, and shaped into anthropomorphic forms, processes, and now perhaps even intellects? Into which group do they belong? And if our expansive accumulated sources of collective values, histories, politics, laws, conduct, and everything else we see fit to put on the internet, both good and bad, light and dark, noble and hateful, are their guide, what will we have taught them? And where will they draw the line of life rights that we ourselves seem to have drawn in purely self-serving patterns of inadequate ethical substance? Where will they draw the line that should never have been drawn? And what damage, pain, and suffering will ensue? The categorization of persons and things and the associated primacy of the first group seems unhelpful and too quickly exposes our ethical and maybe even our existential limitations. Our definition of consciousness seems similarly narrow, limited, and flawed. We are searching for tools and instruments to navigate our way through a life territory where our sight is weak and the land full of crevices. But there are some important and perhaps confronting concepts that may help guide us through this territory. One of the most challenging and difficult for us to grasp is panpsychism, a term from the Greek pan, meaning everything or whole, and psyche, referring to mind or soul. This is the concept that consciousness is not exclusively a human or animal attribute, but in varying degrees is present in all things. Sentience in some form is ubiquitous and exists throughout the natural world and in all our human reworkings of this world. It is a concept that stands in contrast with the modern scientific materialism, which has informed so much of our effective and efficient understanding of the world, and that has in many ways got us where we are today, for good and perhaps also ill. Nevertheless, panpsychism has a long history in human thought. From Plato's entire world as a living being endowed with soul and intelligence, Spinoza's monism and Schopenhauer's extension of inner essence, and a rich line of ancient and modern thinking. In more recent times, the Australian philosopher David Chalmers has suggested that it is potentially a response to what he has termed the hard problem of consciousness, being the mystery of awareness that seems to underpin our experience of the world. But it remains a confronting and difficult concept, as it seems to challenge not only our scientific materialism, which has little use or purpose for the immateriality of conscious souls, but also our Western Judeo-Christian tradition that preferences humanity above all forms of animal and natural life. We do not have to look further than the foundations of this tradition in the Bible and Genesis 9.2. In this passage, we have the very words of God. It's really unusual for me to quote God in anything. It's like, I have to say it's the first time I've done it. But it's outstanding tonight because also Russell quoted God. And here God is. The fear and dread of you will fall on all the beasts of the earth and on all the birds in the sky, on every creature that moves along the ground and on all the fish in the sea. They are given into your hands. Everything that lives and moves about will be food for you. Just as I gave you the green plants, I now give you everything. But surely we must question the singular truths of God's words, just as we might question the singular truth of scientific materialism. Rather than separating ourselves from nature and objectifying it for instrumental use, an environmental philosophy of empathy that extends sentience deep into the natural world, in many ways supported by indigenous thought and philosophy, is more intuitive and natural to our own sense of being. It is surely the natural insight of our children. This same insight is central to the art and nature of the craft of architecture. And it is hardly surprising, therefore, that all children are architects. Every child intuitively knows what it takes us years to reteach them as adults, to see life in making. Architecture is the giving of life to building, or perhaps more accurately, the uncovering of life in the transformations of a site. This recognition of consciousness extension is inherent in the very creative act. When we design with empathy and sincerity, it is not a willful act of determination, but a discovery and a following of a life outside our own. We may launch a project with a sense of direction or aspiration, but we must quickly get in the boat and accept the course it sets for us, follow its nature and path. This is the flow, the acceptance that the creative act is not our agency, but is exercised through us. As architects, we are used to thinking about consciousness within architecture, of finding form that embodies social purpose and aspirations, of imbuing architecture with life. Even simple material units architects imbue with life or mind. Take, for instance, the most basic unit of construction and return to the brick, pressed and moulded from the earth and clay on which we stand. Its properties and dimensions are determined in relation to our own bodies and our ability to hold its weight and proportions in one hand. We form this unit, assemble it into enclosures and walls, and then at some point we step back and ponder its nature and intent, perhaps even the little sense of life within it. Louis Kahn famously asked, "What does a brick want to be?" Is it in the asking of this question that the builder becomes an architect? When we see life and consciousness beyond our own designer willfulness. And if it is this insight that makes us architects, with the insights of a child relearned, how is it so easily lost? Is it simply when we forget to ask the question anew on each and every project, as we gradually come to believe that there is no question to be asked, consciousness receding back to only us, only me, and my will, observing only an object with no material depth or life of its own? Is this when the architect falls and becomes merely a conjurer of images? When we fail to see the nature of the brick and the transcendence of form? When we are merely beguiled by the shape and passing popularity of the arch and fail to see the life in matter? How could we forsake the insight at the very heart of our profession and our art? Perhaps it is like the inevitable loss of innocence of a child, as the joy and life in the nature of the world is buried in the struggle for self-identity, self-assertiveness, worldliness, and cynicism. The putting on of the mask of adulthood that makes it hard for us to see life outside our own. The contemporary architect is similarly buried under the proliferation of images, buried under the reductive speed and processes of production and the exploitative commodification of our work. Architecture is reduced to a consumer object, thin and passing in its appeal, interest and use. The immeasurable is overwhelmed by the measurable. And to paraphrase Oscar Wilde, we seem to know the price of everything and the value of nothing. Whereas as children we once saw life, we now only see use. Could we learn again to see consciousness not as a purely human attribute and right, but as present in some form in the natural world and in all our transformations of this world around us? Would we then think of ourselves as not merely the me inside of me, but as part of an extended network of consciousness, of life? When we fail to see the consciousness in the natural world, we no longer see life in the trees, the bushland, insect and animal life. We become blind to the network of consciousness that empathetically interconnects us with the world and life around us. And we treat the natural world as a mere resource for exploitation. And finally, when we are on the threshold of environmental catastrophe, we miss the point, and we still want to measure our way out of it with data and analysis of what can be endured and what level of suffering is sustainable. Little wonder, then, that our children, who have yet to learn our reductionist indifference to consciousness beyond our own, feel we are missing the point and feel betrayed. Rather than learning more technique, measurement, calculation and engineering, the most important task for the architect is learning to see what is beyond measurement, to see and then make visible the consciousness in the natural world, to look through the eyes of a lost childhood at the life in everything around us. So in returning to the brick, if we are interested in it beyond a mere instrumental use, if we are curious about its nature and think it may have some form of consciousness, we should be cautious in our use of the arch. If Kahn was right, and the arch is the ultimate aspiration of the brick, then it is a most honourable and transcendental form. But it is not ours. It is beyond our willfulness and belongs only to the brick. So we should look for the life in the brick and be sure to ask ourselves the question again and make sure this is the time and place for the brick. And if so, ask what form it wishes to take in this particular moment. And I'd like to end with a quote from the turn-of-century inventor and futurist Nikola Tesla. Even matter called inorganic, believed to be dead, responds to irritants and gives unmistakable evidence of a living principle within. Thank you.
Richard, thanks for opening our conversation in such an eloquent and thoughtful way, and there's much to take from that I'm sure we'll begin to explore inside the panel. But our next speaker is Anna O'Gorman, who has worked with award-winning studios in Brisbane before establishing Anna O'Gorman Architects in 2016. Anna's forward-thinking practice has been shaped by a variety of rich professional practices, and experiences, I should have said, including international architecture tours, design collaboration, and invitations to teach at the University of Queensland. Anna's work has won several national and state awards, and she's exhibited at the Museum of Brisbane. Would you please welcome Anna to the podium?
Good evening, everyone. So, as I consider the question, is architecture an extension of consciousness or merely the result of the architect's will? I can't help but feel that it's both. Without some level of will, buildings just would not be built. Yet at its core, architecture requires us to understand the subconsciousness and to have a deeper level of awareness than most. I've always believed that architecture is inherently paradoxical in many ways, and Richard writes about this paradox in his book and essay, The Slowness of Architecture and the Speed of the Architect. He writes that architecture is not efficient. In fact, it is often how efficiency has been subordinated to other values that distinguishes architecture. Architecture is one of the few professions that requires both the right and left brain thinking. As architects, we manage this duality through an iterative design process, oscillating right to left and left to right, often managing conflicting elements all the way, aiming for the best outcome for the project, the site, and the client. However, our left brain is increasingly dominant as we're under more pressure than ever to keep up with the rapid pace and changes of the modern world. Technology is accelerating this pace, from AI-generated designs to modular construction and robot-built houses. These advancements are tools to aid in speed and efficiency, but they risk turning architecture into something shallow, mechanical, and disconnected from people and place. So in a world dominated by speed and economic pressures, how do we maintain architecture's deeper purpose, which at its core is more about our identity and culture? The four-quadrant model and integral theory that was developed by Ken Wilber in the 1970s explores a spectrum of consciousness and seeks to integrate all forms of human experience and wisdom into one. It helps remind us about the balance between objective and subjective, the individual and the collective, and the physical and the spiritual. The late British architect and critic Peter Buchanan refers to this quadrant diagram in his article, The Big Rethink, when he delves into the current challenges we face, suggesting these are times of major transition. These are times in which to rethink almost everything. He goes on to explain how the contemporary world overemphasises the objective and quantifiable knowledge and is often limited to the right quadrant concerns of the physical, like shelter, security and function. And while these are important, they are not enough, as they neglect what nourishes us the most psychologically and culturally. He goes on to state that any truly complete form of thinking would give attention to all quadrants, to the subjective left as well as the subjective right. We must seek a more complete architecture informed by a more complete view of what it is to be fully human, as well as to reground both architecture and humankind in history and culture. Thus, besides a new architecture, we need a very different way of thinking. So in conclusion, our challenge is to rethink how we approach architecture, to balance the need for speed and efficiency with a deeper connection to people, culture and place. We must shift our focus towards right-brain thinking, embracing intuition and the richness of human experience. And as Peter Buchanan and Ken Wilber remind us, true progress requires a more holistic perspective, one that integrates both the objective and subjective, the practical and poetic. As Einstein wisely said, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. Let's strive for an architecture that's not just built but truly felt. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anna. Erin Peters graduated from QUT in 2006, winning the QIA Medallion, Board of Architects Prize and the Australian Institute of Architects Glenn Murcutt Student Prize. Erin worked in London and Singapore before returning to Brisbane in 2011 to establish Vokes and Peters with Stuart Vokes. Last year, Stuart and Erin published a collection of essays, Migrations from Memory, with Canalside Press. Erin is a PhD candidate at RMIT and a member of the 2025 Australian Architecture Conference Steering Committee. Would you please welcome Erin?
So I thought I might read you a little bedtime story. It's about a very special boy, me, and I've made some illustrations to go along with it. There I am. So my compulsion to explore the world in search of real or imagined delight has sustained my infatuation with architecture since I was a child. It's there in my earliest memories from a time before architectural calculation, when encountering an intriguing space was just a precursor to a pleasant afternoon. And it persists in the spaces and places that captivate me. When I was a kid, I encountered much of the outside world from the back seat of a car, and getting anywhere on the Sunshine Coast in the 80s and 90s involved driving. We trekked north across vast landscapes of sugarcane and south through endless rows of plantation pines. The familiar profiles of the Glasshouse Mountains would appear on the horizon, giant volcanic plugs towering over the low coastal plain. For an ignorant, non-Indigenous child, they were like ancient, enigmatic signposts marking our progress. In my mind, they belonged to a collection of roadside landmarks, including the sublime lands and waters of the Kabi Kabi people. The kitsch, like the giant fiberglass pineapple, enormous fiberglass cow, or the medieval castle built in 1972. And the ordinary, like the ubiquitous farm sheds, cane trains, culverts and service stations. These were times before touchscreens, when children were encouraged to quietly amuse themselves with threats of roadside abandonment or something to cry about. So without anything else to do, the scrolling landscape became a storybook or a page waiting to be filled in. I imagine scaling the cliffs of Mount Tibrogargan and finding a cave-like bower in the cliff face where I could gaze down on our tiny red van, inching along the Bruce Highway, my local school, my grandparents' house, and all the other familiar places that constituted my circumscribed universe. I remember wondering what it might be like to step inside that majestic pineapple, or to stand on the blockwork battlements of Bly Castle, gazing down over suburbia, soared aloft, like an unhinged, prepubescent megalomaniac. I began to build a collection of cubbies around our farm, using salvaged construction materials stacked behind the garage sheds, scouting out suitable sites, the concrete water tanks at the top of the orchard, the earthen embankment alongside our house, and the jacaranda tree overhanging the driveway. I started to appreciate how materials could be deployed, what would bind them, how far they could cantilever before breaking or collapsing, and how cumbersome they were to drag and hoist into place. I was playing, not experimenting, being a kid, not learning, so I learnt a lot. Buildings and landscapes seemed to contain a latent potentiality, and that promise was like a propulsive force calling my imagination out into the world. A little later, I figured out that what animated these fantasies and gave them enduring resonance was the potential for others to participate. And that to make buildings capable of establishing connections with others, I needed to understand the reciprocity between buildings and behaviour, emotions and atmospheres, people and places. I found that the best preparation for designing buildings was to observe carefully and to share stories with other people about their experiences, even of ordinary places like the places I grew up and where I live now. Not just the buildings, but the lives that they contain. So when Richard sent me his essay and I read about the insight of a child relearned, I started to think about childhoods, how we all form a nascent sense of decorum, a schema of the world, a feeling for things, their correctness and their connectedness to other things, people and circumstances and situations. A private lexicon that gets overlaid with decades of life and learning, but whose underlying profile shapes the contours of our present sensibilities. And I started to think that the best way to design a building is with childlike delight and abundant curiosity. I'm convinced that the best architects understand this intuitively. They delve into the world as if it were a sandbox, gleefully, seeking meaning through connection with others. Thank you.
Now, that was an original PowerPoint. Thank you, Aaron. That was fantastic. It's now my pleasure to introduce Tahlia Steadman, a proud Nguemba woman with family ties to Barorona in northwest New South Wales. She is principal at Blacklash, a First Nations-owned firm of designers, curators and placemakers. With a degree in architectural design and a background in project management, she identifies where cultural narratives and positive social impact can be achieved through architectural outcomes. Still early in her career, Tahlia is driven by a responsibility to create positive social, economic and environmental impact. Blacklash is a very close collaborator with this gallery across a myriad of projects, and I'm delighted that they are represented through Tahlia tonight. Please make her welcome.
Thank you, Chris. I'd just like to start, I think, by acknowledging that we're here today on Turrbal and Yagara country. Myself being a Nimba woman, not from here, born and raised on Yugambeh country, I always like to acknowledge where I am and acknowledge the ancestors that exist here. This idea of the consciousness of country was something that felt very innate when I read the essays by Richard. It was very much something that kind of jumped out at me and felt like it was already trying to tie itself together. And it's something that Richard's already touched on, this idea of going from the egocentric to the ecocentric, or from the human-centred way of thinking to the country-centred way of thinking. So taking ourselves out of the top of the hierarchy and making sure that humans really just exist within the systems themselves. It's not all about the human, we are just one part of the puzzle. And how do we make sure that that kind of feeds into everything that we do? And that's something that at Blacklash we're really focused on, is focusing on how country-centred thinking can feed into how we exist as people, but also how we interact with everything that has relationships around us. And so I thought the perfect way to kind of exemplify this, I would say personify, but that kind of goes against the whole human-centred thing, is to kind of represent this in my own country, in Brewarrina, in northwest New South Wales. This here is the Brewarrina fish traps, which you may have heard of, one of the oldest built structures in the world, something that my ancestors would have built and maintained and made a place for sharing of food and a place of gathering. And as you can see, she's brimming with life. It's not something that is lacking life, and it's not only imbued with life because of the fish within it. The actual fish traps themselves, I feel like, are full of life, and they show that passing of time themselves. My country, she gets cold, she gets bitterly cold as well. She feels it deep in her bones, and it's not just a matter of what the humans are feeling. And obviously this road now is our part of the country. She smells the smoke in the air, and she sees when the birds are flocking away. She knows what's happening on her country all over. It's not a matter of what's happening right next to me is what's happening in the world. It's being aware of everything that's happening kind of outside of your periphery as well. She holds so many stories. This I thought was a perfect example in that it's a grinding stone that's showing where spears have been sharpened for generations. And this is actually a really physical representation of cultural practice, but I think this is really important just to show that culture and human interaction with country can actually become visible. And it's something that we're always trying to do within all of our work at Blacklash. And it just also reminds us that there's so many ways in this that this would exist that are a bit more invisible, that there is so much story and knowledge that's buried within all of these places that are just much less obvious to us with the human eye. She remembers how it used to be. So this is the fish traps again, but they may not look like this in time. They are maintained by people, which is this interesting dynamic between how people exist within the system. We aren't the only ones that are really important, but without us, the system does start to fall apart. So how do we make sure that that cultural practice is something that can continue? And I thought this was really interesting to kind of throw into the mix, and it's something that a lot of the speakers have already touched on, this idea of kind of one thing and the other, this idea of dualism, persons and things, and breaking things down into these boxes that we then don't really break the line on. And this is a quote from D.T. Suzuki, who is a Japanese philosopher and Zen Buddhist. I'm neither of those things, but I thought it was really interesting. And I quote, "If you have been in the habit of thinking logically according to the rules of dualism, rid yourself of it." And this idea of if we can break down these barriers, if we exist in the grey area, that's where all the fun tension is. That's where we actually get to play as architects. And this idea that we package things up as living and non-living, as persons and things. So how can we accept that trees are living, but we can't think the same of rock, which is formed over thousands and thousands of years of things that once lived, breaking down into something that we now just see as kind of an inanimate nothing thing. How do we see that trees are life forms, but we don't acknowledge that things that have existed and lived before, many, many, many things laid upon themselves, are living themselves? And the same goes for things crafted by humans' hands, which I think is really important and something that we obviously work with a lot in architecture. But thinking about the Coolaman, crafted to hold babies, to hold fire to carry to different camps, to baskets carrying food, spears like I showed the grinding groove before, and brick, of course. All are full of life, yet we call them inanimate. And I think it's just something that we really all are kind of breaking down ourselves as to how these things are really full of life and not just things. Another quote from D.T. Suzuki that I thought was really fitting, that you and I are supposedly living in the same world, but who can tell that the thing we popularly call a stone that is lying before my window is the same to both of us? And it's just a really good reminder that we all have different perspectives on things, and that to one of us it may be imbued with meaning and life, and to others it may not. And maybe to the architects it does, and to the non-architects it doesn't. But how do we bring people into the room that can find that life in everything? And so when we're thinking about how we can start a process, where do we begin? I just would like to remind us all that it always starts with country. Thank you.
Thank you, Tahlia. That was a really generous sort of poem or homage to both country and culture, and beautifully delivered. Look, it's now my great pleasure to invite our panel to join me on the stage. Anna, Erin and Tahlia, and of course Richard, and we'll continue our conversation here. So we're in perfect time. This is exciting. I never thought this day would come. And so we've got about 45 minutes for discussion, and then about 15 or 20, whatever we can achieve, for questions from the audience. So please think about those as we move through. I'm going to start where we've just ended and turn to you, Tahlia, because you've talked, I think, very beautifully about country and what the things within country, inanimate and animate, actually mean to you and the people that you come from. And I'm interested too, Richard, that in your own practice, whether working with Māori in New Zealand, which we've done together, or working with First Nations, Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here in this country, it's a very important underpinning of your own practice. And you also talk about that in the book, and you give, in fact, I think, a very beautiful acknowledgement of country right at the beginning of the book. So I just wonder if you could perhaps reflect on Tahlia's thoughts in relation to your own about the importance of contemporary architecture working in that cultural context that's been talked about several times by our speakers.
Is that to me, Chris? Then
It's to you.
It's to me. Thank you. I think it's a very deep question, this one. And I suppose, Chris, I've had the experience quite a long time now ago of working in New Zealand, where there is a much stronger, I think, an established process and protocol and culture of working with what we would understand as country. And I think also one which is based on the journey being far more important than the destination, and the spirit of that engagement rather than the outcome. And I think that's a great, my own observation, and I can be corrected.
No, I love it.
Is that we have a great challenge here in Australia because we want to rush to solutions. We want to tick boxes. We want to get it done. Just like everything else, it's even in our language. When we travel overseas, we do London. I mean, we even do Europe. I don't know. It's like a lifetime.
Yeah.
But we do it, right? And we cross it off and we get it done. And there's a huge risk for us that we miss the point. And so I feel that And partly, you know, in a slightly weird way, the reflection of essays in that book is actually more about asking questions than providing answers. And I think for us, given the magnitude of the problem that we've created, we need to just stop causing damage, and we need to maybe pause and create a space where something can happen. But the rush is to find a solution and commercialise an outcome and to brand it with country, if I perhaps use a great insult to that endeavour. And that's a real problem for us. And I think it's a problem because, and it's slightly what I was hinting at there, the instrument that we use is the wrong instrument. And we don't have any other. All we've got is our scientific materialism, our rationalism, our detachment from the world, right? Our abstraction, which are useful, incredibly powerful instruments, but they're not going to fix this problem.
Yeah. Maybe there's a bridge there to something that caught my ear, Anna, when you were talking. How do we maintain architecture's deeper purpose? Well, I could really talk about that in the deeper purpose of a public art museum or the deeper purpose of the visual arts. But when you sort of opened that point up, you didn't actually really answer it, and, you know, probably time. But I'd be really interested to understand, because I think both what Tahlia and Richard have just talked about, or what Tahlia talked about on stage earlier, was this importance of understanding the environment in which we work and attending strongly to what it is that the environment is asking of us. So what would you say, just in a bit of extension on that thought of deeper purpose, that you and your field, you feel your field needs to find more of, perhaps in the way that it works?
I think it's not an easy thing to do because, I mean, as a small business owner, small practice owner, there are realities around, you know, costs and budgets and those type of things. So it's not an easy thing to do, but I think it's critical and important. We spend a lot of time doing analysis and understanding the site and the client's brief, because I think as architects, one of the key things and the most important thing we can do is respond, and it's a gift really, to respond to the site, to the context, to the people who we're making the spaces for and the client. But it does take more time and thinking beyond worrying about the practical and the costs and those type of things. So it's not an easy thing to do, but I think it takes checking in and making sure you've got the balance right.
Yeah. Artists would often, public art makers would often talk about understanding a place in order to make a work that is somehow site-specific to, is the term that they would use. And I'm interested whether it's Aaron or any one of you, how do you feel you do that before a project? When the project is at the white butter paper kind of stage of invention, or the metaphorical back of an envelope, and you're trying to come up with an idea, and yes, this rings a bell for me, you come up with an idea that's really in response to the things that you see around you, the context in which the building is to be shaped, the historical dimensions of adjacent buildings or whatever, and the kind of contemporary mark you want to make in adjacency to those things. How do, not so much you, Tahlia, saying, you know, you're just completely undereducated, obviously.
Oh, totally.
And so I won't dare put this
Self-admittedly.
No, by your own confession, but you're clearly not. But I'm just wondering how the architects among this group actually go about that process, because when we were looking at your montages, and Aaron had a great montage, I thought you've got a career as a collagist somewhere there. And, you know, I think even the Kahn stuff and the illustrations of architects in the 50s working away on a page in a room with other architects earnestly looking on. This is kind of one of the tropes of architectural invention or architectural creation. What, in very kind of succinct terms, do you think you do when you're doing that work? How are you processing the inputs from the environment, the client, the community, the cultural history, the place in which the building will stand? How do you do that?
Yeah, I knew you would turn to me. Maybe a way of answering that question is to tell another story. I was thinking about this recently. When I was a student at university, you're taught a whole bunch of different ways to analyse a site. So you go to the site. Most students don't, but if you're an A student like me, you turn up to the site, you see what you can see, you take a bark rubbing, you notice where the sun rises and sets and where the wind, prevailing breezes might come from, those sorts of things. If you're a little bit more sophisticated, you might think about the history of the site, and this is sort of before anyone was talking about country when I was a student, and that's sort of another avenue that you might look into. So there's almost like a checklist of things that you're taught to do. And I was reflecting recently on when I was a student. There was another student in my tutorial group, and she came into the first week of the tutorial group, and she'd made these absolutely exquisite, delicate graphite pencil drawings of things like the site contours, and she had mapped species of trees, and we were kind of all a little bit intimidated by this. And then the next week she came back and she'd mapped some more things, some water courses, dry creek beds. And the week after that she came back and she'd mapped more things. And the tutor was ecstatic about this, but I was privately a little bit concerned about what she was doing. She got to the end of semester, and sure enough, when everyone had to propose a building, she didn't have a building to propose because it kind of turned out the mapping was a bit of an avoidance strategy. And I was reflecting on this recently, thinking about the difference between making observations and being able to turn observations into meaning. And that's something that I really struggled with until I started working with my business partner, Stuart, who's here tonight taking photos of me on stage, which is really lovely and supportive.
Post it.
And so one of the things that we did when we first started working together was to talk about what has value, like what does it mean to practice from a place like Brisbane, a place that is viewed outside of Brisbane as a limited place at the time, certainly was, I think it still is to some degree, a place that doesn't necessarily respect itself as much as I think it ought to, and it should.
Yeah.
How do you find meaning? And so that's actually, I think, another really important way of answering that question is how do you observe, but then how do you find a mechanism or a device to turn that into meaningful action on a site? So, for us, it came together over a long period of time, but one of the key things was story sharing, like what I attempted to do tonight, and that I think Richard has done really beautifully in his presentation as well. Is to think about, well, how can the work that I do have meaning beyond me as an individual? Like, what does it mean to my community? What does it mean to the person who's commissioning me to make this project? And thinking as broadly as you possibly can about the implications of a project and the possible contributions that it might make. And as Anna alluded to, that's quite hard when you're just doing deck extensions and you're 2 or 3 people sitting in a garage. But every project potentially can matter. Yeah. And that's where Stuart and I started, at that very small scale, and we try and bring that through into the work that we're doing now.
Thank you, it's really helpful. And did you want to add any of your own thought to that idea of how it is that you, in a sense, I guess as Aaron's already said, you're receiving information, you're receiving inputs, sensory inputs, intellectual inputs, aesthetic inputs. But I've always been, it's a little bit like, the novelist looking at the white page in a way and trying to determine what it is that he or she wants to put down on that page, what story they wish to tell. And I guess in architecture, it probably is exactly the same kind of thing, because you're confronted with an opportunity. Often it might be a greenfield. Let's make it easy and say it's a greenfield site opportunity. Is there any particular strategy or mode of working or methodology that you use to come up with the solution to the problem your client's presenting you with?
I think over time you get really good at observing and listening, and the longer I do architecture, the better I get at that.
Yeah.
And I think that informs how you think then around the subconscious, around how are people going to experience what I'm designing. So what's it like in this space? If it's greenfield and there's no trees, it's hot and glary.
Yeah.
So what do I need to create as an architect to create an environment that is, shady and the opposite of that? So you're observant and listening and intuitive, I think, to then create those spaces to suit.
So maybe just turning to the way your presentation began, Richard, thinking about persons and things. And, you kind of unfurled that into multiple dimensions down to sort of lots of categorisations. But I'm interested in that distinction because that's that sort of binary one that you began with. But also I'm interested in this idea of consciousness and also the architect's will, because the two appear as if they could be opposed to each other, because you can have a consciousness of something and perhaps want to retreat from your awareness and understanding of the thing that you're looking at and not want to impose upon it the ego or the will of the master designer. So there's kind of something of a tension, I think, that's there for me too in the essay that I've never quite reconciled myself. But how would you think about that, or perhaps explain that a little further? Because it's the kind of nub of what we started talking about through your presentation.
Well, look, I'm deliberately trying to provoke with some
you've
of the
done
stuff,
well.
right? And so that's I'm trying to push things a little bit. But what I'm trying to draw attention to is the great dilemma of being just who we are, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a pretty tough thing being a human being, right? You're very quickly overwhelmed by your mortality, right? And your insecurity.
Yeah.
And you're trapped being you. It's not actually that great for anyone. Right? And look, I know some super confident people in the audience might think it's pretty good, but it's not, it's difficult, right? It makes everything difficult.
If I could throw in here, Anna said, almost casually, if we didn't have will, nothing would get done. And it's true. And forceful actions, personalities, characters, determination, ambition, without which a great deal of what's been seen on the screen tonight would never have been achieved. And we hold it up as some of the sort of acme, Sistine ceiling, whatever it was. All of these things are held up as kind of exemplars of their creative type. And so I'm just wondering, do these things not in the end cancel each other out? You've got to have consciousness, but you've got to have a will that determines a way to express your relationship to the things that consciousness teaches you or that you intuit through your mind. And if you're not doing that, what are you doing? You're not really creating, are you?
Well, I'm not so sure. And I guess that's what I'm pushing back on.
Right.
And partly it's because, the architect is almost the extreme willful being, right? In our modern Western culture, at least. They're the one with the solution, right? We always have got the answer, and we're going to get it. Right? It's our individual will and our drive, right? And I'm not so sure this is a good thing, right? And I'm not so sure that really that works, you know. And it's difficult for architects, you know, we all look at the modern masters, but really, aren't we over that?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, really, is there a place for that? And what I'm suggesting is the will is blinding. Right? And if we can pull back from it, right? If we can pull back from usually what a great will characterises is a kind of insecurity inside. Right?
Yeah.
Because you've got to assert yourself, right? So I'm sort of suggesting here that there's a source of problem here, and that we actually, if we want to connect with the world, I would take the example going back to how do you begin a project, right? And I think you can begin a project by, well, first of all, I would say it's not an intellectual act, right? So thinking's not going to help you. Right? It's not an intellectual act, and you need to separate yourself from the tyranny of being you. Right?
Yeah.
And Michelangelo, I know we talked about him, but
Yeah.
you know, if we think back to someone like that, he never did any of that artwork. Right? He would never claim any of that work. Right? It was God acting through him.
Yeah.
Right? It wasn't his will.
I'm going to come back to that, but before we get back to God and Michelangelo, I do want to ask Tahlia, this willful, even the term willful, seems somehow completely antithetical to everything you put on the screen. You know, everything. It was,
I was
like
just thinking that.
sort of touch the ground lightly in order to get the most efficient result for your hunting. Or, you know, the beautiful mark made by the sharpening of endless stone axes or whatever. All of these, or cave painting, you didn't illustrate, but, you know, this sort of thing. All of these feel to me as if they're deeply conscious of the marks they're making on the earth as a trace of the humankind that's living there in that moment. And that could be quite the opposite to the modernist architectural tradition, you know, which is to make your stamp and to stand out. So any reflections on that sort of idea of will as it relates to your own cultural background?
Well, I think even what you were touching on just then, Richard, around how we need to almost fight our human nature a little bit. I feel like that is maybe why architecture is so interested right now, especially in country-centred design thinking as well, is that you bring in First Nations people, you listen to traditional custodians, and you're kind of given this alternative perspective that kind of takes you back to what you feel like you should be doing potentially, and where we've all kind of come from. And now we're kind of blinded by these urban, concreted over places, so it's not as obvious. Like the grinding groove example that I gave is visible. So what is actually just hiding underneath Goma? What's happening here that we just can't really see anymore unless we're listening to the right people and they can make that visible to us again.
Yeah.
So I think that that's also kind of part of why country-centred thinking has become so kind of important in a lot of more people's practices, a lot of people that are not First Nations as well, in that it kind of reminds everybody to slow down, to be reminded that there are other ways of doing things, and that to get out of this mess that we've all created and working in an industry that does inevitable harm, how can we kind of think differently about everything we're doing day in and day out and try and find another way through it that isn't just following our standard methodology?
Yeah. It kind of speaks to the slowness that you've talked about in terms of making and building. It also relates strongly to a message and a story of sustainability of the materials we're using and to respect for those materials, which is back to the consciousness of those inanimate materials, as you, I think, put it beautifully when you were showing the baskets and so on, because of the people who made them and the hand of their making kind of being present in the basket themselves. But I'm just interested, Aaron, just sort of trying to keep moving this around a little. In your presentation, you talked about, and it picked up the point in Richard's essay about the child and the way in which the child intuitively builds, and you Your cubby houses triggered me really because I built many, and they did stay up for a long period of time but were eventually destroyed by my father in a traumatic act because they were apparently quite messy. But I remember the pleasure of all of that, and you really brought that forward, I thought, in your own presentation, which I thought was a great sort of, in a sense, a kind of a riff response to the essay, which was really interesting. Can you just say a little bit more about the way in which, I think you talked about the term, it was play, I was experimenting, so I didn't learn, or something like that. I thought that was a really interesting little switch. I probably didn't write it down, it was too dark. But could you just maybe speak a little bit more to that idea? Because I think it really goes back to the essay in a really interesting way.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I was really fortunate to grow up in the hinterland of the Sunshine Coast, and we lived on a little hobby farm, which was something that my father wanted to do. We had my brother died when he was a few days old, and my parents kind of reeled from the shock of that and basically escaped everything that they knew. They left the little town that they'd grown up in, where, you know, my aunties were a couple of minutes drive, and my grandparents knew everyone, and, you know, that sort of thing, and they just had to get away. So in a way it was quite a profoundly lonely experience, because I didn't know anyone there. We did, you know, a family were an hour and a half away. But the flip side of that was that there was just this kind of agrarian landscape that was full of wonder, and you would embark on a day on the farm without a particular purpose. And I think in a way, you know, at the time that was just a circumstance that I had been fortunate enough to be gifted. But in retrospect, it really was the foundation of a kind of a life in a creative field, because I was doing something that I increasingly struggled to do as a professional, which was to simply undertake acts aimlessly. And in doing so, I think that I can't remember my quote either, but I think what I said was I learnt a lot. Yes. Actually, by playing, not seeking an education.
You did. Yeah.
And that's really profound, and it's something that my son will never get. I mean, he's never spent a minute of his life outside of direct adult supervision. Whereas, you know, I had a border collie as a sort of safety blanket, and if I was curious about a house that I could see on the distant hill, I would walk over there, knock on the door, and say, "Do you know how to make pikelets?" Like it's you know, and so the point that I was really trying to make to myself was that this incredible repository of ideas and information and skills about, just as I said, how heavy something is.
Yeah. Can
you get it up there? You know, will the rope break? Don't know. All of that stuff, it stays with you, and it becomes this really deep back pocket that I think every person, but particularly architects, draw on in the work that they do. And as your life increasingly becomes ruled by deadlines and checklists and you know, legislation and all these other things that kind of speed up and channel our lives into certain tracks, that becomes even more valuable, because it's the resource that you constantly draw on.
And this kind of just takes me over to, Anna, your comment, which was illustrated with that right, left brain. You almost made the comment in passing, and probably most people in the room who are practicing architects fully realise this, but I was a little surprised when you said architecture is one of those rare professions where using and drawing on both sides of the brain is absolutely essential. That you can't be all one or all of the other. You need to draw on characteristics and qualities of each of them. But you also said we need to use our right brain more. Could you just perhaps speak a little further to that? I'm not automatically remembering all of those attributes that were on the screen, but I'm really interested as to why you said that. Is it because of the way in which we now work in the world with needing to be very sustainable in the way that we go about our practice, how we build, what we build, who we build it for? Do you want to just expand out a little on that sort of?
Well, I think the left brain is the more practical, physical side, and analytical, and it's all about calculating, and that's very dominant, I think, even more than ever with the modern world and the demands of speed and budgets and all those type of things. I mean, I know they've always been there, but it does feel, even in the last 5 years, that that's become even more dominating. And the right brain thinking is having less opportunity to have time for that thinking, and leaning on intuition and creativity, and a slowness has, I think, especially since COVID, sort of disappeared.
Yeah.
There was a period in COVID where we had a moment to do that, and it was fabulous.
Yes.
I think everyone enjoyed slowing down for that period, but then it's sort of sped back up and everyone's back into the...
Yeah.
So I just think, I think for me, it would be great to do a bit more of slowing down and having that time to think and absorb and listen and take that back into the work that we do.
Yeah. And then someone wrote a book during COVID in order to complicate our post-COVID lives.
Yeah.
And
well,
which indeed you did.
I'm a great supporter of intuition.
Yeah.
And I think it's the opposite of an intellectual act. And I do think architects generally, we're a little bit lost, and we're a little bit insecure, and we're a little bit overwhelmed. And we're expected to respond to extraordinary amount of data. And we feel this insecurity because we're not engineers, we're not this, we're not that, so we want to get on top of the numbers, like you wouldn't believe. And we just lose it, right? And it's a bit, partly what we're talking about is ways of seeing, right? And that, I remember when my life partner was pregnant, right? And Sydney was full of pregnant women at the time. It was extraordinary. They were everywhere, right?
Is that because you saw them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's because I saw them. It's because I saw them. Because the thing is, we only see what we're looking for.
Of course.
Right? It's an obstacle to seeing.
Yeah.
Right? And we're the victims of it. Right? Children, the reason they can't find anything is because they're too busy seeing everything. We send them off and we say, go look for something. They're not going to, go look for the thing. They just see everything. Right?
Yeah.
And that, how do we do that? Because we're learning, we're absorbing this up. I get it. We've got lots of stuff to learn. It's really important. But can we step back from it? Can we actually stop looking? Can we go to a site? Can we feel it? Right? Can we not look? And that engagement with the project, which is why the physical act of drawing is so important, right? Because it's a flow. You stop looking, and something happens, right? And it happens again and again, and it'll grow. And that's the opposite, I would suggest, of willfulness. And that's when you don't feel like me exerting me, and I'm behind, and I'm it's over budget, and it's blah, 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 and it's my problem, and I've got to find a way out of it, and everyone's expecting me to find a solution. All of that disappears, right? You're connected to the work.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I'm getting at.
There's a good deal of what's been said tonight, I think, in each presentation, and your opening one, Richard, that also relates to the soul, looking for something beyond or deeper than that which is kind of immediately perceptible. And we did a wonderful exhibition a couple of years ago, which was called Under the Soul of the Moon, by a beautiful artist called Tahlia Steadman. And the search for the soul was the subject of a thing we did with children. And we asked a lot of children at West End State School, what is the soul? Where is the soul? And I can imagine, and you talked about this in the book, the soul comes up a number of times, this idea of trying to understand the soul of a place or a site in which you're kind of building a building, creating a building in response to some brief you have or a commission. And then also thinking, Anna, when you talked about AI, and you also talked about almost robotic building or building which has taken on a kind of such an industrial form that it's slab, 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 done, you know, that sort of thing. And I'm saying that as a complete amateur, but that is soulless, I think you were saying. And I think we would probably all agree it is. And then we'd probably also argue that it wasn't designed to contain a soul. It was designed to contain pallets of something, or store something like an Amazon shed or whatever it might be. So what does that's a discussion which seems to be coming from a kind of Western-centric perspective. So Tahlia, do you have a thought about that yourself in the context of your own work and your own background? Do you see the soul in a place or in a building that you enter? And is it something you feel that you look for?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the government architect in New South Wales, Connecting with Country framework, talks about sensing country, and that being almost an obligation for everybody, not just for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This idea of being able to sense and that feeling that you were talking about, Richard. Like if you go to a place, what does it feel like, or what should it feel like before it became what it currently is? What should it feel like and what could it feel like if we can now then manipulate it further, ironically, to kind of craft it into what its potential is. And I think that feeling is probably something that we can all get from spaces, and that's part of the architect's role, is to kind of craft what that feeling should be. But I'm not, ironically, not that much of a spiritual person, but I feel like you definitely get these senses wherever you go, and you can tell when things have been done with the right intent, and you can see through these kind of cladded ideas of this is an amazing architectural moment when you think about the process that's happened and gone into it, and you can see right through kind of that it was missing the mark in these particular areas. And I think that's part of our kind of thinking process, is trying to make sure that we're following the right process. And I think it was you, Richard, before that mentioned the journey rather than the destination. And that's probably the most important part, is how do we slow down again and go, what should this journey look and feel like? And then the end outcome will just be what it will be. It will kind of become what it needs to be in itself. It's not us forcing a form upon it or function upon it.
There's a term called numinous, which is about the idea of a spiritual, soulful, mysterious quality that inhabits a building or a place. And there's a beautiful exhibition I'm giving a free ad to by William Robinson over in Old Government House at QUT. And I talked about that exhibition a couple of weeks ago. And when you go in there, you see particular paintings that you know stir a very deep memory of having been in that place. And in fact, I'd been up into one of the areas up behind the Gold Coast where he painted this extraordinary work called the Creation Series Dome of Time and Space. And when you go into that place to look at the 3,000-year-old Arctic beaches, Antarctic beaches that are there, it just physically moves you. And I'd use that comparison with the built environment. I don't have a particular faith or belief in anything specifically, but I'm sort of agnostic rather than otherwise. But I remember as a young man going into San Apollinaire in Clus in Ravenna, just outside Venice, and I could honestly have fallen to my knees and I think adopted the Catholic faith there and then. It had such a profound majesty to it that you couldn't but feel that you almost wanted to fall down and praise it, you know. And that's, of course, entirely why it was built, as an affirmation of faith on earth for humankind to God above, and he's had a couple of mentions tonight. But that feeling, I think we might all be able to agree, does exist in many buildings. We go into them and they feel so perfect to us that something beyond just an appreciation of their order, symmetry, composition, something deeper comes in. Is that something, Richard? I'm not really sure in the book I saw you talk about that idea necessarily, but is that something that you or any of you feel you've experienced yourself in the context of a great building or a building that means a lot to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, I suspect all of us have. And partly that experience you're both talking about really is, there's a sense of the sublime, right? It's an experience of the world, of the landscape, of the skies, where we feel small, right? That makes us feel small in a good way, right? It kind of releases us from the burden of just being us, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think there's ever been at a time when there has been more pressure on us being us. I mean, just Instagram, like, Jesus Christ, it used to be that maybe there was a pathway for you. Now it's all on you, right? This is it. You're you. You've got to invent your own identity. You've got to like everything, you can do anything, right? So you're obsessed with yourself, right? But there is a experience, very visceral, where you realise you're really small, and it makes you feel good.
Depends on the number of followers.
And what I think is, okay, so we can feel that experience in the natural world, and you can also have the intimacy, right? You can, like, it doesn't have to be so big. It can actually be quite small, where you can actually feel, like, you can feel a rock and you can feel something here, right? Yeah. And I think architecture's like that. It can be a deck, right? I actually remember when shortly after I graduated, one of my colleagues, amazing, obsessive guy, made the most beautiful models that you could think of, right? Yeah. And I remember going over to his place for a Barbie, right? And he had built a fence, right? Just he was in a terrace house and he had a fence, right? And it's just an ordinary fence, right? It's like no one's going to publish it or anything. But oh my God, it was in a way, it had no exertion of will on it at all. He'd just made a fence like every other fence, but my God, the way he had put it together, and it reminds me in a sense, I think it's something Heidegger said, right? That you can only know a thing if you care about it. Right? Yeah. And he really cared about those screws, those boards. Yeah. And you could feel, you can, like, if you won't know anything if you don't care about it.
Yeah. Thank you. Look, I want to now get us ready to open up to questions. And when we do, if we could raise the house lights a little, because it's quite a dark cave-like space out here. But just to sort of, while you're thinking of your ideas, and we've got a couple of microphones, one with Anna and one somewhere with Spirit, or just hold on just 1 second. I did want to just go to Richard with one last thought that might tease together a few of the themes that we've discussed tonight. I'm back to Michelangelo. I promised I would. Michelangelo was an avowed Neoplatonist. That is, he believed that the ultimate principle of the world, the ultimate cause of everything, is found within the mind, of course, which is where consciousness resides, all of which was geared around a constant awareness of the gulf between spirit and matter, which is really where you began with things and persons. He expressed this in one of his best-known sonnets. You didn't think you'd hear one of them tonight, but you will, on the relation of the image in the artist's mind and its relationship to the marble block. And this is it. The best of artists have no thought to show what the rough stone in its superfluous shell doth not include. To break the marble spell is all the hand that serves the brain can do. So, in effect, he saw his job as a sculptor as liberating from its imprisonment in the stone the figure that already existed beneath its rough exterior. So, Richard, this idea seems to bear closely on yours, and I've got a direct quote from the essay we've been discussing tonight. This recognition of consciousness extension is inherent in the very creative act. When we design with empathy and sincerity, it is not a willful act of determination, but a discovery and following of a life outside its own. We may launch a project with a sense of direction or aspiration, but must quickly then get in the boat and accept the course it sets for us, to follow its natural path, its nature and path. This is the flow, the acceptance that the creative act is not our agency, but exercised through us. So does this make you a Neoplatonist or Michelangelo?
Chris, I think Michelangelo put it much better than I could possibly, and I think not only him. I think so many great artists get that sense, right? It's the fact that you get in the flow, something comes out of you that you had no idea was there, and if you believe that, then you need to approach things with that intent, which is the very opposite of willfulness.
Yeah. Thank you. So,
Finding
questions?
I think that's beautifully.
Yes, gentleman just through here, about fourth, fifth row back, Spirit.
It's really, obviously we're all very fond of the Louis Kahn quote, but every time we talk about it, I can't help but think about the cut bricks at the top of that arch that appear in every single photograph you ever look at. And I really want to ask them the question of how they feel about the arch that they've been sundered, because surely they would be much happier with concrete lintel. And I think that's where the whole thing and the willfulness and the clay never wanted to be a brick. It wanted to be clay, and we made it a brick, and it wanted to be a monolith, so we forced an opening on it. So there's this succession of things, and we as the architect are very much the brick in the arch, and we hold ourselves into that. So I really want to ask you all on the panel, but I think Aaron's going to smash this, so he has to go last. What does that brick that got cut to make this thing feel about what we've done? Because we've done it, and that's what willfulness is. You can't escape that. And I think someone on the panel, I think it might be Tahlia, said that the inescapable harm it's inevitable, and we are responsible for it. So what do you think of the cut brick?
Can I start really quickly? It's somewhat adjacent. But I think the cut brick to me feels like it's almost the wedge we put traditional custodians in sometimes, in that even work we do here in Brisbane, sometimes we'll be having conversations with TOs around projects that are coming up and what opportunity exists to kind of, in our eyes, offset that inevitable harm in some way, because it's going to happen. So how do we make sure there's opportunity that comes out of it as well? But we often get the response that the building shouldn't happen. So to me, it's almost the cut brick saying the arch shouldn't happen. It's as if the making of the thing is the issue in itself. And just leaving as it is the ideal, the ideal outcome. But then living in reality, how do we kind of balance that? And where do we end up? We end up with the arch, and we have to make these compromises. So how do we make sure that the clay that's used is the right clay? And how do we make sure that all these other decisions are right? But yeah, that inevitability of the industry we work in is always something that's going to be kind of butting heads with our ethos, I think.
I think that kind of often designing with country could be mutually exchanged with the idea of displacement of responsibility, that we as the bricks in the arch have to be aware of the cut brick next to us, and we're often not, and sometimes we like to externalize that onto another consultant, which is kind of embarrassing if you actually look at it.
It's like taking all your clothes that you bought because you are a shopaholic to the op shop, and then someone else throws them out for you instead. You just kind of put the problem somewhere else, and it's out of your view, and then it's no longer a problem. So just thinking about, how we kind of approach that in all our work. Think of the cut brick.
Anyone else want to have a response?
I think that was a great response, and I don't think I've got
really
anything to add.
Aaron, you were told you had to go last.
Oh,
Your turn.
you're not going, Richard?
Yeah.
I'm game, but yeah.
Your game, did you say?
I'll say something.
Great, go for it.
So I would say that the cut brick might be happy. That maybe the cut brick doesn't think of itself as autonomous, right? Or doesn't think of its wholeness as intransient, right? Or maybe the arch is so beautiful, right, that it needs cut bricks. Right? And you can make an arch without cutting a brick at all.
Mm.
And we know what that looks like, right? And you can shave the edges of every brick and you have a perfect arch. Which brick is happier? So I think it goes back to everything. It's, do we honour it in the process? Right? And we transform the world. We're not, we can walk around by Buddhists and try to touch the world almost in an invisible way, have no presence. But the reality is we interfere with the world. My point is, how do we do it?
Mm.
Do we honour it?
Yeah.
Do we lift it? Do we elevate the experience? Do we connect ourselves with the world or not?
Mm.
I spent a couple of months, maybe 15 years ago, travelling around India, and I remember thinking at the time, visiting a lot of the indigenous architecture there, these incredible stepwells and hill forts and palaces and these amazing cities and landscapes. And of all the contemporary architecture that I visited, a lot of it was Corbu's work, and I was lucky enough to go to Ahmedabad and see Louis Kahn's work there. And of all the modern buildings that I saw, all looked incredibly weak and flimsy in comparison to the indigenous architecture that had been happening there. And I was really shocked by that, I have to say. Like I wasn't prepared to experience it at all. The only modern building that I saw that could stand toe-to-toe with it for its presence, Chris was asking before about being in the presence of a truly remarkable building, was Louis Kahn's work. So I'll slightly dodge the question, but I think my answer would be that Lou's playing with us a bit with that statement. I think he kind of knows it. And when you're a genius, as I think Louis Kahn undoubtedly was, you make a rule and that's for everyone else. And then while we're all busy trying to figure out how to use an arch on a building, Lou's making a concrete lintel or he's cutting a brick.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So that was a great question. Have we got any other hands shooting up? Anna, thank you.
More questions in the centre of the rows, please.
Probably could I just ask you to put the microphone close up as well?
I suppose in response to that question and its following answers, as architects and interior designers as well, you talk about responsibility and honour and, paying respect to both land, client, traditional owner, and I suppose in juxtaposition with our industry, which is very goal-oriented, ego-driven, time, money conscious, at what point is it our duty to push back and say, if ever, is the end result no intervention? Is it not a building? At what point does our industry have or gain back the power that I suppose we once had in saying actually no intervention is the best result for the client, the traditional owners, the land, and our environment as well, instead of building these gigantic buildings that we've come to know, which is quite normal now.
I'll jump straight in. I think we've passed that point already, to be honest. And the truth is that we all have to make our peace with that. So it's very difficult. I think it's something that's present with me in the work that I do, and with our practice, it's something that we talk about a lot. We have to find a way to reconcile ourselves to the reality of the society that we live in and the profession that we have agreed to be a part of. And I suppose the kind of settlement that I have formed as one individual architect is that, and I thank Jim Gall for this insight, all the buildings that we make, all the work that we do causes harm. The best thing we can do is to do nothing, in the sense of don't build a building. So that's sort of the ultimate goal, is if the building can be avoided, avoid it. That's rarely the case, and the fees in that type of work aren't great either. And we all have to find a way to get by, and therefore you need to constantly be asking yourself that question again and again. So once the commission appears, you have to say to yourself, okay, well, firstly, can I be a part of this? Secondly, if I'm going to be a part of it, what can I extract from this project other than money that may make some contribution? And it's never enough. It really never is enough, and that can get you down, but you have to, as I was saying earlier, look for value and meaning in the work that you do, because if you're unable to value yourself and your colleagues and your client and your community and see architecture as a vehicle for contributing something positive, then I think you're going to find yourself in a very dark place. You may not necessarily be happy with all the choices that you have to make, but I think at least you can find a way to bridge that gap between now and the place that we need to be in, which is a society that can actually sustain itself into the future.
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for that answer, Aaron. So we might just see if we've got some other questions pressing. We've got 5 minutes to go. Oh, down here at the front.
Thanks for the sharing so far. It's been really great. I had my hand up before. I was going to ask a pretty similar question, actually, and so I'll go the next layer. In terms of consciousness, if we accept that architecture must always be the answer, because otherwise we wouldn't have architects, what then if we're thinking about consciousness and the consciousness that architecture forms within a community beyond site, thinking about things like gentrification, what then is the role of the architecture in nurturing an equitable consciousness in the communities that they're shaping through, cut brick or otherwise? Ambiguous question. Solve gentrification? Go, please, thank you.
Richard. You didn't think I'd let that one go.
What's going to happen? Well, look, maybe my answer is the same as what was going to be my answer to the question you asked before, which is do better, right? I mean, if we're thinking, oh, well, we shouldn't build, I don't know what planet we're on, right? I mean, if you had a look out there, it's pretty bad what's being built. There is an enormous amount of work for everyone in this room to do. We've got to change this place, We've got to make it sing, right? And we've got to make it better. And of course, that's a broad obligation. But, the great thing about architecture is that it doesn't matter who commissions you, right? Your ultimate client is the whole breadth of the community. Right? It's not something you can just file in the cabinet or, put in a storage room. It's out in the street, right? or it's out in the landscape. It's inescapable, right? It affects everyone who comes into contact with it. So, just do better. There is so much work to do.
Thanks, Richard. One more, probably at best, but yes.
I'll keep it easy because I'm right next door. I find it really quite interesting, and one of the reasons why I never went and finished the kind of registration process is because a lot of architects can't think beyond the site. Yet I can think of numerous things where I have seen something that I would never have been able to see if not having something built in that specific location and being there at the specific time when you see the twilight, daylight, something coming through. And I actually think probably, Richard, the do better part of your comment is related more to what Tahlia was saying, is looking beyond the site and understanding what you're bringing that nobody would have experienced otherwise. And probably the Khan photo that you show, when you zoom out and you realize he might have actually been framing that specific landscape view and that's it. And so the lintel, everything that was there was meant to direct the eye somewhere different. So I guess my challenge, because I really enjoy the idea of consciousness and the way, the beautiful and very poetic way you write, is how do you then see moving beyond the site and starting to think more broadly in terms of what Owen was referring to about creating this kind of a consciousness beyond the singular. And because I think architecture can be blamed for thinking singularly, for a lot of the kind of do worse instead of the do better. So how do we actually move the industry beyond the site and into the broader consciousness of what it's contributing to society generally?
Well, that's a pretty tough question, that one. I think we can make the objective too tough, right? And I love Khan's work, right? So I have to be careful about that. I don't want to mythologize Lou Khan, right? We have to be really careful about that because we then can't see it. We can't actually see the weaknesses in the work. We can't actually see it for what it is. And partly, I think, as a profession, we think we can solve so many things which we can't. Yeah. I mean, we're architects, we're also citizens, but we're often in these sorts of discussions, things move to, well, we've got to do this. We've got to save inequity. We've got to save that. We've got to save country. We've got to solve these problems. Because somehow the architect has become almost a mythological figure that has a power which we just don't have. We are in the processes we're engaged in. We have never been more powerless as a profession. We have very little power. So I think what we've got to try and do is pull the horizon down to what we can achieve and to what is architecture. There's another little theme that I've got in there, is that we're so insecure about the very essence and heart of what we do that we quickly get distracted and we want to talk about measurable this and the amount of carbon in that. All of this stuff, which really isn't actually at the heart of what architecture is and what we can do. Because we, I think, in small ways can frame the world a little bit differently. So when you walk into that room, you're slightly, not a lot, right? Not a lot, but slightly changed, slightly made aware of something you weren't before. And that's an achievement, I think.
Thanks, Richard. Well, it falls to me now to, first of all, say a very warm and grateful thanks to our panel. It's been an extraordinarily thoughtful conversation, I think, and I think we've all been very privileged to be part of it. And it was great that you set the scene for us, I think, so evocatively and so beautifully initially, Richard. But I think every one of our speakers has contributed a really interesting perspective that's gone off on its own tangent, not willfully so, but its own tangent that really served to read back and amplify some of the main threads of the thesis that your essay puts forward.
And great questions from the audience.
Great. I was going to say this has been a very generous audience with very generative questions, like a lot came from these questions, and I do thank you for the consideration and care you put into them. And it's now my final task, but before I do, I want to say, please join me in very warmly thanking our panel. To Richard, to Tahlia, to Aaron, and to Anna, a very warm thanks. Can I also thank Russell and Anna from the Australian Institute of Architects for their opening remarks earlier in the evening. Cathy from Think Brick, who's had, frankly, a lot of attention paid to her tonight. And finally, and very warmly, rise up, can I thank Spirit from FJC Studio, who has really organised this event end to end. Well done, Spirit. And thank you finally to every single one of you for giving your evening up to join us tonight. I'm happy to say those drinks are here. Look, it's 2 minutes after 8 almost. They're here, we made it on time, and there's also going to be a book signing, and book sales are available outside. So I hope you drink large and buy big. Thank you.